I know many times in those cult meetings, I would often hear them say in these really bold voices, usually kind of semi-shouting or lecturing or scolding like they normally like to talk like when the old-timer hierarchy or one of the people that's not quite in the hierarchy yet, but is trying to kiss enough ass to become a part of the little in crowd that runs every particular home group. I would always hear somebody have to declare, "Faith without works is dead." Or I would have to hear somebody read something out of the book, and they'd say, and the part that jumped out to me, the part that really spoke to me more than anything else, was faith without works is dead. And somebody else would say, well, I love what you read. I love the whole entire topic, of course, but I love what you read. And the part that just jumped out to me more than anything is faith without works is dead. They would often say that sentence in these bold proclamations like they had made some grand statement that contained some absolute truth about it. And yet nobody could ever really quite explain to me what that was about or what that was supposed to mean. The best I could ever come up with as a result of hearing them regurgitate that same line over and over again, which is mentioned like 3 or 4 times in their silly little book, is going to meetings and doing these steps, which I'm convinced that 90% of those people don't ever do, to be honest. Like some of them old-timers talking about when they did their 4-step and they came to this conclusion about something that happened in their childhood and everything was made crystal clear and they just knew that AA God was talking to them when that happened. It almost sounds too scripted to me, not like something Hollywood would touch, even with some of the garbage that Hollywood has churned out. I don't think they would touch something quite that corny. It would be more like something you might hear in some Hallmark film or some Lifetime TV movie of the week or something like that that was made a long time ago too, like during the time of Just Say No to Drugs period, those kind of hokey TV movies kind of lines. But I mean, in your cult big book, there's in Bill's story, he says Ebby declared faith without works was dead. He told him, well, Ebby died drinking, so I guess he didn't have the faith without works. It's funny, faith in the AA cult religion just means not drinking. In the action on steps 8 and 9, he says, faith without works is dead. Let's take a look at steps 8 and 9. We need more action, without which we find faith without works is dead. And then in another page in his In the Action chapter, for some reason I can't switch back and forth between computer screens, so I got to use my phone for that. But the next chapter is entirely devoted to step 12, because faith without works is dead. Faith has to work 24 hours a day in and through us, or we perish. To be vital, faith must be accomplished by self-sacrifice and unselfish constructive action. And it goes on and on and on. There's a whole segment of horseshit where that's quoted in their silly little book. And it's so funny it's funny to me how many people in the meeting would say Bill W. said that, like Bill W. actually made that up. In truth, and as someone who grew up in a household with a lot of religion forced on him, and had to read the Bible quite a lot, which I know a lot of Protestants that I've encountered before have been shocked by that. You're a Catholic and you actually read the Bible. Yeah, it's kind of a bit of an anomaly. I could go into that more, but I'll get sidetracked off my topic here. But faith without works is dead is actually mentioned in the Bible. It's mentioned in the book of James. It's a part in the book of James where he uses Abraham as an excuse to justify the claim he's making in one of his letters. He says that when Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son Isaac, that was faith with works, because faith without works is dead. Apparently, Abraham hadn't proven that he had real true faith until God comes along and tells him, hey, you love me, kill your son there on the altar. And Abraham says, sure, I'd be glad to do that. I love killing my own children because you tell me to. And apparently God lets him almost do it. And then God says, I was just fucking with you. I didn't really want you to kill your son. Just kill that sheep over there. That's pretty good enough for me. That's where that whole entire faith without works is dead comes from. It comes from one of the letters James supposedly wrote in the Bible, which I don't know if anybody else ever encountered this or not, but in some AA meetings I go to, I'd hear people say, in addition to reading the big book, I also read that real big book, that other big book. I don't know exactly. For a program that's supposed to be spiritual and not religious, they should have all kinds of ways of telling you how you have to worship, how you have to pray, what you have to believe, and how God truly works with you only when you do these things this way. Faith without works in their meetings translates to, I do all these rituals, like doing these steps over and over again, sitting in these meetings, drinking this shitty coffee, and repeating and regurgitating all these lines I've been told, and constantly bashing myself as being worthless without being able to go out and do anything as faith with works, apparently. Apparently, that's their idea of faith with works, because faith without works is dead. I've never heard anybody share at a meeting, though. I went through a period where I wasn't drinking, but my faith didn't have any works behind it. I wasn't doing anything, you know. They'll generally call it something like white-knuckling sobriety, or they'll call it dry drunkenness, which, by the way, would actually prove that you're not powerless over alcohol if you can white-knuckle your way through the AA meetings and through the AA program without doing any of it correctly. Because first they'll tell you to take what you like and leave the rest. Then they'll tell you unless you can do it exactly like we tell you to do it, it don't work and you're going to get drunk again and die. Which is also kind of ironic coming from an organization that tells you to act as if, to fake it till you make it. To fake it till you make it, but faith without works is dead at the same exact time. So in other words, you can have no faith at all, faith without works, until you do have faith with works, because you're going to fake it till you make it. But if you do that, that's faith without works, which is dead, which means that if it doesn't live in you 24 hours a day, we perish. It's another funny thing I always thought about when it comes to the AA religious text. They're always talking about, you know, we're going to die if we don't do this. If we drank again, we would surely die. If we did this, we would surely die. To have a resentment, we could possibly die. I'm going to rip off a line from the Old American Jesus channel where he said, you know, when it comes to dying, I think it's 100% safe to say that one day I'm going to actually lose that bet about, you know, living another 24 hours. There is going to come a time when I'm going to die, whether I'm sitting in a meeting slurping up old nasty coffee and talking about what a wonderful person I am, or whether I'm, or whether I'm in a hospital bed, or whether I'm just alone at home and just keel over in a car crash, or any of the other innumerable terrible ways that you could exit this world. But it won't have nothing to do with going to AA meetings and calling sponsors and going to meetings. I mean, one day we're all going to die, whether we have a resentment or whether we are religiously inclined or not religiously inclined. The funny thing about this is that when you analyze what the actual biblical interpretation of this would be, meaning the works you do, the way you act, and the way you behave, would be a demonstration of your faith, meaning that you could go around declaring that you have all this faith. You could go around declaring that you're a religious person. You could go around declaring that you're a moral person, and turn right around and do none of those things, is actually the prime example of faith without works, which ironically enough is a walk-in textbook example of Bill W., a walk-in textbook example of most of the AA old-timers that I encountered. You know, the ones that go in there and tell you how they're doing all this stuff and how they don't gossip on people any longer and how they work on their resentments and how they inventory their problems and all this other kind of horse shit. And then the second the meeting is over, the first thing they generally do when they're not gossiping on somebody is they throw a fit because the meeting didn't go their way, or they get all upset and angry because of some little minor trifling thing, and they make a big, huge deal out of it after just saying that they don't do those things anymore because they did all these steps and had this white light religious experience that cured them of all drinking. It's kind of like Bill W. claiming that he had like this Moses burning bush experience, where something spoke to him from the clouds above. He kind of left out the part where he was taking all that LSD on top of it, but he claims he never had a desire to drink again, never did this, that, and the other again, just, floated around on cloud nine for the rest of his life. But we know for a fact that that's not true. As a matter of fact, there's a couple of articles I read, I'll have to find them and maybe even do a video on those, where at the time he wrote the 12 and 12, he would actually come in and hold the typewriter and cry in a completely nervous, broken down state, and literally said he wanted nothing to do with AA anymore, but the AA program was actually demanding he put out another book, which he didn't want to write, which he actually wrote on the condition that they kind of severed ties with him or whatever it was. The fact of the matter is his right-hand man at the time, named Tom Powers, was working with him, was so disgusted by his behaviors in other areas of his life that he ended up quitting him. Kind of proves that he was a man who had the whole faith without works thing. He sort of went around blabbering all this stuff and blabbering about what a wonderful person he was when he didn't practice any of that in principle. So it makes him a walking textbook example of faith without works being dead. He actually proved his own point, if you choose to believe that. I mean, I'm not a big person on the idea of faith. I'm kind of a big person on the idea if you have this code that you prescribed that everybody has to live by, and this is how everybody ought to be, and this is how everybody ought to think, and this is how everybody ought to feel, then you ought to at least practice what you're preaching there. Even though I kind of look at the weird, twisted religious ideas that he put forth in AA as being just that. Weird, twisted, sick religious ideas that have absolutely nothing to do with stopping addictive behavior. I didn't drink because I was not in the sunlight of the spirit. I didn't drink because I drank not because I wasn't in the sunlight of the spirit, or because I was self-centered, or because I was driven by 100 forms of fear, or because I didn't have a good relationship with AA higher power, or whatever, other garbage they throw at me. I drank because I had a drinking problem, and my drinking problem had to do with a lot of factors that is not covered in AA. AA only gives you these pseudo-religious horseshit ideas that are all twisted, that was put forth by him, that don't actually even cure anything, that has not proven to even have a very good success rate. They love to go around parroting how it saved millions of people, but then when you point out the huge fail rates among them, they'll say those people just didn't want to quit drinking badly enough, which, by the way, negates the idea of being powerless, because if you quit drinking because you want to quit drinking, then you can't be powerless over alcohol. More walking contradictions here. Kind of like an old-timer I knew that used to prey on newcomer girls that had just come out of treatment with no place to stay and no place to live, that used to lecture people in meetings about how behind every skirt there's a slip, and you have to invite God in the bedroom before you partake in any sexual activities. This is some weird, twisted, puritanical horseshit idea about sex, coming from a guy that liked to steal money from his male sponsees, and who like to prey on the women who had just got out of treatment with no place to go, would even buy them heroin and crack cocaine in exchange for sexual favors, but would tell you that you have to invite God into the bedroom. And when we get into this type of behavior, it has nothing to do with all this blabbering about faith, and it has nothing to do with all this blabbering about spirituality. It's nothing but good old-fashioned, plain, ugly, fucking hypocrisy. It's hypocrisy of the whole idea of do what I say, just don't do what I do. So you could put out all this fancy blabbering about faith and all this fancy blabbering about works, which has zero to do with a drinking or drug problem. But in truth, all it proves is that this is just another sick, twisted cult religion that has all kinds of weird, outdated morals that go all the way back to the Dark Ages. And they're throwing this at people with real psychological problems and real issues behind their drinking problems to puff themselves up in their little bitty houses of hypocrisy. I remember one guy that used to act like he was saying something real fucking profound in the meetings. He'd say, see, unlike religion, I'm not punished for my sins. I am punished by my sins. Whoa, now, Madon, that's some heavy shit. What you're really saying is your lousy actions have consequences. Which, by the way, he obviously didn't believe because he loved to steal out of the basket, and he loved to sell Xanaxes, and he loved to buy food stamps. So, I mean, I guess he wasn't, I guess those weren't sins. I guess what he was talking about is if he picked up a drink, it would be a sin. I guess that's the way it kind of works with the AA cult religion. It almost reminds me, because they throw out all these vague, broad terms and these grandiose assertions that they don't really have a way to actually provide an explanation for. And if you pin them up against a corner and you tell them, well, you're saying this, but you're doing this, your big book says this, but it also says this, then they just do a whole lot of denying and double talk, and they do a whole lot of twisting and manipulating and playing semantics games. In other words, they have to make a whole bunch of excuses for something, which kind of leads me to believe, to the conclusion, as I've obviously put forth on many videos on here, that it's utter fucking nonsense. There was a book I remember, I had a few friends when I was a real young guy. I was trying to think, I would have had to have been maybe 1920. I remember I had my own apartment at the time, and I was working as a cab driver at that time, so it had to have been maybe a little bit later than that. But anyway, I bumped into these group of people that were big Anne Rice fans, and I had never read Anne Rice at the time, but they just highly recommended her. I ended up becoming a huge fan. I read all of her books at one point. I didn't read her later works, but during that time period, I read all of it. But the very first book I picked up by her at the time wasn't from the Vampire Chronicles. It was actually a standalone book. It was called Servant of the Bones. I won't go into all the plot details about it, but I do remember part of the central theme of the story involves a young girl, and it involves a cult. But the religious cult is run by this guy that's only interested in enriching himself and doesn't actually have a belief system of its own. In fact, the cult itself got started by ripping off certain aspects of other cults. There was a line in the book, I can't remember the exact quote, but it said it's the only cult without any belief system whatsoever. It just uses a whole lot of phrases and dogmatic ideas and certain recruiting methods that all the other religions use, which is exactly what AA is as far as I'm concerned. It's just ripping off a bunch of things from a bunch of, it rips off some things, most of it from the pro-fascist group called the Oxford Group, who sided with Hitler during World War II and said it wanted a worldwide dictatorship of men controlled by God, which, that's a picture-perfect paradise group of people I would like to follow. And the rest of it is just a lot of blabbering nonsense that is ripped off from a few Sunday sermons here and there. But that's really the core of the whole entire thing, and it's just a disgrace to me. It's a complete and utter disgrace that in the year 2023, we're still court-ordering people into this outdated religion that has absolutely no bearing on reality and no bearing on substance abuse problems and no bearing on alcohol use disorder. And I think I've talked for about 16 minutes here on this one, so chime in on the comments about the hypocrisy of faith without works is dead from people that would preach one thing in meetings, do another thing outside of the meetings, and tell you that they were very spiritual people. I remember one of the worst AA bullies in the whole entire program. I mean, real bully. He'd go out and pick on people who had just come in relapsing, while they were still shaking, while they still had the hospital band on their arm, on their wrist, while they were still barely out of the hospital, barely off being detoxed, and he would just bully them mercilessly in front of everybody so he could get all kinds of cheering points for being some kind of fucking AA badass. And then he would actually quote in meetings that, like the big book says, I'm hard on myself, but always considerate of others. The worst part about it is I think the dumb son of a bitch actually believed that. I remember somebody kind of called him out on that one time, and he was ready to kill the person over there. And he had his teeth all gritted. He said, are you calling me a liar? Are you calling me a liar? If I'd had that to do over again when he was doing it to that guy, I would have said, no, I'm calling you a delusional fucking nutcase or a goddamn hypocrite. That's what I'm calling you. That's what I'm calling most of you. Anyway, ran over for this week. Catch up with you next week, hopefully, and until next time.